Hello, this is Judy Van Wyk from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Rhode Island. I'm going to talk to you in this video about COVID-19 ripple effects as they relate to family violence. Anything that touches a social institution, even if it's temporarily, changes it forever. That's a pretty profound statement to make, but it's true. Social institutions are created by stable patterns of behavior that provide basic functions for a society. Those functions are things like family, education, medicine, religion, government and politics, social control, the economy, and labor and work. Although these social institutions exist in all societies, they look a little bit different. They're described a little bit differently within the same culture over time as change occurs and between cultures. Social institutions are not corporeal in nature, but they're instead patterns of ideas. Of course, you can look at a school and see that education probably occurs there because in our culture, we've defined education in such a way that requires the use of these buildings we call schools. But if you weren't from this culture, you might look at one of our schools and wonder what the heck goes on there. That's what's meant by there being differences in the ways that each society identifies, describes, and defines their social institutions. Social ideas are influenced by social experiences, just as individual experiences change individuals who experience them. So if something happens to you personally, it becomes a part of who you are. It's part of your history. It changes you forever. The same thing happens to societies. When one of these social institutions is impacted by something, then it changes that social institution. It sort of rewrites the history of that social institution from that point forward. The interesting thing with COVID-19 and this pandemic is that it has touched every single social institution in every known society. So it's not something that's isolated. If you think back to the events of 9/11, that certainly had ripple effects throughout the entire society, actually throughout the entire world. But it was concentrated, the act of the events were concentrated in one area. You could actually go through your day and walk out of it or not feel like you were personally experiencing it if you were in the right context. However, with COVID-19, you can't get away from this experience. And so it's impacting you every single day of your life. And the same kind of influence is happening by COVID-19 on our social institutions. So the way we define and identify and think about family in this particular culture will never quite be the same again after this experience. And the same thing goes for our educational institution, our medical institution. All of the various religions have been impacted by this, politics, government, and so on. So that's what makes the ripple effects important. These are things that are going to stick around in our social institutions as having created change in our social institutions long after COVID-19 is gone. Before we talk about the way that COVID-19 has influenced family violence, I want to talk to you a little bit about what family violence is. So sort of a crash course, Family Violence 101. There are a few caveats of this body of research that knowing makes it a little bit easier for you to understand what's going on when researchers talk about family violence. Since 9/11, the term domestic violence has shifted away from family violence studies. Although the phrase domestic violence is still being used in family services and in psychology and in a lot of clinical applications, it's not used as much anymore in the empirical research that is done on domestic violence, or what we're now calling family violence. It used to refer to violence that centers around the household. Now it is utilized in terrorism research and is often synonymous with domestic terrorism. The latter means terrorism within, for example, the United States, or what's often also referred to as homegrown terrorism. But the phrase family violence is less than ideal also, since family is so broadly defined in the area of research. Even in law, it's broadly defined. Rhode Island law defines family to include the following. The first two you would expect: spouses or former spouses, adults who are related by blood or marriage. The rest of them broadens the definition probably well beyond what you typically think of in mainstream society when you hear the phrase family. They include adults who reside together or who have resided together within the past 3 years, regardless of their interpersonal relationships. So here we're even just talking about roommates are considered as family in the state of Rhode Island. People who have children in common, even if they've never resided together, and people who are or who have been in a substantive dating relationship within the past year, regardless again if they have ever resided together. So, family is not just who you live with, it's a relationship according to the law in Rhode Island. And it's a relationship that doesn't require intimacy, as most definitions or most perceptions of family violence would assume. How a crime is categorized determines how it's channeled through the criminal justice system and how a crime is prosecuted. And the issue of concern is that researchers have to explain all of this every time we talk about the topic, because commonplace understanding or mainstream understanding of what is meant by family is different from how research defines it. Something else that it often requires some explanation is the kinds of behaviors that are included in family violence. Furthermore, the types even often overlap, and clearly one type is often correlated with another one. The word violence is as broadly defined as family is in the research. Family violence includes physical harm and the intent or threat of physical harm, regardless of whether or not its effects are visible. Sexual harm, which also includes what we would obviously assume would be sexual harm, but also coercion and threats. Emotional and psychological harm, which includes things like neglect of children and the elderly, even when such neglect causes no physical harm or it does cause physical harm. Economic harm, which includes issues of control over somebody else's finances. And all of these other crimes are included: stalking, vandalism, trespassing, kidnapping, homicide, violation of a protection order, obstruction of a telephone, so blocking someone's use of either their own telephone or access to a family phone, burglary, robbery, arson, among many other crimes. So really, it's not the type of crime that defines family violence or even defines violence. Now, I've used the word harm here intentionally: physical harm, sexual harm, emotional, psychological harm, and so on, to emphasize that traditional mainstream conceptions of violence may restrict perceptions of family violence. So when we researchers say violence, we mean all of these kinds of behaviors. Anything that you do to another person in the relationship of family is considered as family violence. There is no single academic discipline that owns this body of inquiry. Sociology, psychology, human development and family studies, criminology, criminal justice, gerontology, these are just a few of the fields that study different aspects of family violence, and they all study it slightly differently from the lens of their discipline or their perspective, which makes it very difficult, by the way, when you're trying to teach a course on this, because there is no textbook on it that incorporates information from all of these different disciplines. You'll usually find a textbook just from one of these perspectives or on a single aspect of family violence or a particular victim or type of offender. And so it's a very broadly based area of research. There's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there about family violence, partly due to good people just trying to help. When there's an organization that's trying to help victims of family violence, they are usually dependent upon donations. And so they would need to convince you in any way possible that, first of all, this is a serious issue. Second, that everybody is a potential victim, including you. And third, that it's worthy of your financial attention. And so it's not uncommon to find a lot of this misinformation actually comes from those helping organizations that are reaching out to help the victims. So sometimes we get misinformation because of disagreement among professionals, in particular with this area of research about what constitutes a good or positive or healthy relationship. There's a lot of misinformation about domestic violence. Have you ever gone to a meeting and been told to look to your left and look to your right, and one of these people has been X, Y, or Z? Well, that's kind of the impression that you get when you read a lot of family violence information on the internet. You'll often be told, well, every 50% of the population will be at risk of severe domestic violence by the time they reach the age of 50, and these are extreme exaggerations. I'm not saying that domestic violence is not important, and I'm not saying that victimization is a serious issue. What I am saying is it's not very helpful to over exaggerate its occurrence. I think that some people are kind of turned off by that, and so they quit listening when you make those broad, overarching statements that aren't true. Most research finds that about 20% of the population is victimized by common couple violence, and about 3% by patriarchal terrorism, or what's referred to by psychologists as acute battering. The terms, as you can see, we often have different terms for the same word or the same concept because these terms are coming from different disciplines at the same time. Common couple violence, which I wish they wouldn't call it that because that almost normalizes the occurrence of it. In other words, by using the phrase common couple violence, we assume that it's a normal thing that happens in all relationships, and indeed it's not, and it shouldn't. Common couple violence is the kind of violence that usually happens in the heat of the moment or happens in the context of an argument or a fight. And it's not something that is typically ongoing, and it doesn't come out in the same form all the time. And it tends to be less serious in terms of harm and injury. And about 3% of the population is victimized by patriarchal terrorism or acute battering, and those are much more serious. Those are the kinds of behaviors that usually are not precipitated by an argument of any kind or a disagreement. Usually what happens is this is the kind of situation where the victim is walking around on eggshells all the time because they never know what's going to set off the offender. Clear victims and offenders are often undetectable. So there is a term unidirectional and another bidirectional offending that's used in the research to refer to whether the violence is a couple where the victim is always the victim and the offender is always the offender, or bidirectional offending where it changes on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, where you may have within the same fight or argument or upheaval, you may have a situation where you can't tell who the victim is and who the offender is. It used to be referred to as mutual combat in the literature. And this is the situation that police officers often walk into when they're called to a family violence situation, where both people are trying to be heard and both people are harming the other individual. And so, the officer is very confused about what's going on and has to make a determination about whether or not, about who is being injured and what to do about the situation. Another misconception is that women are always the victims and men are always the offenders. This is absolutely not the way that it is. Most of the research finds that it's about 50% of the abuse that occurs, if you're considering all kinds of abuse, is actually bidirectional and heterosexual. And so there's usually a male and a female, and it's sort of mutual combat between the couple. Um, Sometimes women are victims, sometimes only men are victims. Violence, family violence certainly occurs among same sex partners as well. But the idea that that women are always the victims kind of makes the situation even worse for men when they are abused. They're often ridiculed for the abuse that they receive. They have very few places where they can actually seek help or shelter or protection from their abusive partners when the abuse is coming directly from the female. And so this perception or this misperception of violence really does hurt an entire group of people. And so that's very unfortunate. Having bad thoughts about your partner is abusive in some of the arguments against domestic violence. And, if you've ever been in a relationship with anyone in your life, you should know it's only natural to have some bad thoughts about them once in a while. You're never going to be happy with somebody all of the time. But some of the research, even the published research out there, they categorize having bad thoughts about your partner as domestic violence or as family violence. And so if you're reading the research, you kind of have to be careful about the way that the violence is being defined. Family violence only happens in those kinds of families. And in terms of what those kinds of families are, I've heard from people in the general population and in my classes that, oh, well, family violence only happens to poor people, or family violence only happens to people of color, or family violence only happens in cohabiting relationships or in homosexual relationships, or believe me, I've heard it all and it just is not true. Family violence is non-discriminatory, unfortunately, actually, because it makes it even more difficult to figure out what's going on and to help the people who need help the most. Cops won't do anything about it. This is something that comes up a lot in the literature. A lot of people who refuse to officially report the abuse that they receive, they don't do it because they feel like police aren't going to do anything about it. And in fact, there are a lot of precincts now and a lot of states, Rhode Island's one of them, that really goes above and beyond in trying to train their officers well to respond to domestic violence. And it's unfortunate that a lot of people, a lot of victims still have that perception. That brings us to this question. Has family violence increased due to COVID-19? And will it continue to increase once we've resolved the pandemic? Well, good things can have dysfunctional, latent consequences. Families are happy places, or families are inherently toxic. Actually, both of these things are true. That's what makes this kind of difficult. Families are those places where you feel most comfortable. You can be yourself, even if who you are isn't a very nice person. You can express your emotional concerns. You can be emotional within the household where you can't be outside of it at work or other places. There are often issues of power and control involved in families. Think about this for a minute. We raise our children in a way that parents are allowed to exert control over their children. I mean, obviously, you're going to tell your kid what to do and what not to do, and you're going to influence them in certain ways, sort of forcefully, saying things like, oh, you shouldn't waste food, saying things like, don't cross the street without looking both ways. Well, you would never say those things to another adult, hopefully. And so there's a certain legitimacy in the power and control that we exert over children, but then there's a certain tipping point where it becomes abusive. And that tipping point is placed at different points along the continuum, depending on the culture that you're in, and depending on the time that you're talking about within the era that you're in within a certain culture. And so at what point Or more importantly, how do you teach your children that you as a parent can have control over them to a certain extent, but you also want to teach them not to allow others to take control of them, and you want to teach them that it's not appropriate for them to take control over other people? Those are different kinds of messages that you're trying to convey to a child that you may not personally understand yourself. And the child is at a different cognitive stage of a development when you're trying to teach these things. So the reason we have power and control issues among adults is because these are not simple concepts. These are incredibly complex, higher learning concepts. We have a really detailed knowledge of each other within families as well. You probably know more about the people you live with than anybody else, and they know more about you. And so they know which buttons to push when they want to get you angry, and they know how to get their way if they in an argument. And so all of these things make families very sort of volatile situations. In fact, the best known correlate to all forms of family violence is exposure or opportunity. In other words, the time that you spend with your family members. Each additional moment that you spend with your family members increases the likelihood of family violence. And it increases it exponentially. Domestic violence is increasing due to COVID-19 stay-at-home policies, but there are also good reasons for these policies. This is another example of good things having dysfunctional latent consequences. Of course, stay-at-home policies are good for us right now. COVID-19 is spread through all kinds of ways, and coming in contact with other people, or even where other people have been, can be problematic for spreading the disease, and everybody could get it at the same time, and then we'd have hospitals overflowing and people dying as a result. So stay-at-home policies are probably a really good idea for COVID-19. But given what we know about families and how toxic the relationships can become across time, that's going to create some real problems in terms of family violence. And yes, there is reason to believe that domestic violence has already begun to increase due to COVID-19. Domestic violence hotline calls have increased, not only in the United States, but also abroad. I want you to think for a minute, though, about whether or not this is a good or bad thing. On the surface, you say, oh no, domestic violence hotline calls have increased, which means intuitively that domestic violence has increased, but maybe not. Under COVID-19 stay-at-home policies, we have decreased outside supports. And so if you're a victim of family violence and you're used to calling a friend to come and pick you up, or calling a coworker and discussing it with them, or calling another family member outside your household and getting the help that you need, suddenly those options are closed to you. Also, there are fewer opportunities for physical escape. You can't just go get in the car and go drive to the park and walk around, or go to the grocery store, or whatever it is you do when you're trying to escape the violence. And so a lot of these calls to battering shelters and so on, and hotline calls, may have increased because they are a last resort at this point for a lot of victims. So those calls, the increase in calls, could actually be beneficial to the victims overall, and be beneficial for curbing some of the violence that probably pre-existed COVID-19. We may actually see official reports of child abuse decrease substantially, but the incidence of it drastically increase. Why is that? It's typically not the parents or the family members who officially report abuse. It's school teachers and counselors at schools and counselors outside of schools and other people with whom a child comes in contact. Those are the people who report the abuse. And if children are coming in contact less with people outside the family, we're, we're likely to see actual decreases in the officially reported abuse. Also, children are just physically isolated, and so they're spending more time with their parents, which again increases the likelihood of abuse. And they're spending less time around the kinds of people who report the abuse. Domestic violence murders have increased, so the violence that already existed before COVID-19 may be becoming more toxic under the stay-at-home orders. It's exacerbating the violence that previously existed. It's probably not the case that violence is starting for the first time in households ever due to COVID-19. Instead, what we are probably seeing is some of the underlying violence that had occurred is becoming more severe. Also, some of the behaviors that weren't previously seen or understood by the people involved as being violent, so usually controlling behaviors or coercive behaviors, have intensified to the point of physical violence. And so it appears as if the stay-at-home policies are creating violent situations out of nonviolent ones, but that's probably not the case. What about ill victims of domestic violence or partner violence? Victims infected by COVID-19 may be having treatments withheld by abusive partners or abusive family members, or there may be information about the illness that's being withheld. We do know from the research on family violence over the years that unfortunately adults and children with physical and mental disabilities are much more likely to be the target of abuse, especially physical abuse and neglect. Patterns of communication among partners or between parents and their children, or the elderly and the adult children who care for them, may be permanently altered. We get this information from learning theories. We know from learning theories that learning is actually reinforced by affectional bonds. So the more emotionally close to somebody else you are, the easier the learning will occur. And so if children are around parents who are abusive and they're able to get away from it and they're able to get to distance themselves from it, it makes that learning less concrete. The repetitive sort of immersion in the violence will make learning occur more easily, which means that children who are exposed to violence during these stay-at-home lockdowns are going to be so immersed in it, it almost becomes second nature. That kind of learning can have permanent, long-lasting effects, not only on children, but on adults. Intergenerational cycle of violence theories explain why violence tends to occur in successive generations. So why is it that if you grow up in a violent household, you're actually a little more likely to act out violently toward others in adulthood? This is usually explained by cultural learning theories. Remember that whole families are together under COVID-19 stay-at-home policies, parents and their children. Child exposure to interpersonal violence is certainly an issue. In fact, what we find most of the time is when police do respond to domestically violent situations, children are usually present. It's well over 50% of these calls children are present in. Well, right now, during COVID-19, that percentage is going to go up, way up. In fact, it'll be close to 100%. Children are exposed to family violence, to all the various forms of family violence in three general ways. They either witness the abuse directly, which is actually rather rare in households, or they overhear it. Parents will think that the child can't hear them. Well, they'll think the child is asleep or not paying attention, and they're listening to everything that's going on. Or they may know about it from other forms of evidence. So a kid may get up in the morning and see that mom has a black eye, and intuitively from past experience understand that that black eye came from dad. And so though that kind of exposure is a form of emotional abuse in and of itself. Be aware, though, when you're talking about intergenerational cycle of violence theories, that you understand that although adults who abuse their families did experience abuse as children, in most cases, children who experience abuse do not always grow up to abuse their families. So the likelihood that somebody who experiences abuse is going to grow up and be abusive is actually very low. But the likelihood that somebody who is currently abusive did experience it as a child is high. The ripple effects of the COVID-19 on family violence are explained by a broad range of theories. Strain theories argue that people who experience strain, or what's referred to as stressors, will try to ease those strains, try to relieve the strain and the stress that they experience by usually doing normal, legitimate, socially acceptable things. So, for example, if you're having trouble with money, a logical thing to do is to go out and try to earn more money, get a better job, or arrange your work in a way that provides you with a better income. But when those things are not available to you, and you, for example, have a goal and that goal is blocked and there are no legitimate means to acquire, to ease that strain, then often you'll resort to illegitimate or socially unacceptable ways to get to the goal that you seek. This also happens with the removal of something positive. If a strain or a stressor actually removes something positive from your life and you can't find or figure out a legitimate way to fix that problem, you're likely to resort to non-social or unsocial kinds of behaviors to block that strain. And also this happens with the presentation of something negative. A lot of people are experiencing a lot of stressors due to COVID-19. Exposure or close confines, so being exposed to people who are abusive to you and not being able to get away, the loss of jobs or incomes, temporary loss of social networks, so a lot of people are unable to really have the familiarity and the relationships with family members and others that they're used to right now. Children present in the home all the time. This can be a stressor in and of itself. They're bored, they're complaining. New working conditions, working from home probably for the first time for many people. Handling the work-life separation, wondering what time do I stop working when I keep getting emails about work? And just not knowing what the future holds, that expectation that something on the horizon might not be good, might be pretty bad. These are all stressors that people are feeling right now. Now, not everybody's going to feel the stressor to the same extent. Perhaps being in close confines with your family members is not a negative thing for you. And so that particular stressor isn't presenting something negative or blocking a goal or removing something positive. So that's not going to have a big impact on you. But the fact is, as a group, as a society, if we look at, let's say, the United States as a whole right now, most families are experiencing these things, and the combinations of these things are creating stressors and strains that they might not know how to handle. Power and control. Of course, we talked about that before. Families are inherently combating issues of power and control because of the nature of the relationships within the households. However, during COVID-19, we're seeing some false claims of illness to prevent movement. So to prevent somebody from leaving the home when they should be able to, or to interfere with child returns and custody situations. We're also seeing evidence of using lockdown rules as mechanisms of control. So, withholding freedom of movement or withholding food and other things like that. So, we're seeing the COVID-19 threat being used often now by abusers. Self control is an issue that really sort of raises its ugly head when you're out of the public eye. People with low self control tend to be less altruistic. They don't make connections between behavior and long term consequences. They're more irritable and they tend to engage in more risky behaviors. These kind of people are very difficult to have relationships with. It's difficult to be around somebody who's irritable all the time or who has low self control or who really doesn't care about the effects of their behavior on others. But now those people are out of the public eye, and the public eye may have kept them or held them back a little bit from engaging in those kinds of behaviors. Now it's just sort of let loose. There are a lot of correlates of family violence, but alcohol and guns are worthy of note here. During the closures, liquor stores have remained open. Understandably so, because alcohol is addictive, and if addicts don't have what they need, then there can be serious physical, emotional, and psychological consequences. So I understand why liquor stores have remained open. What I don't understand is why gun shops have remained open, but that's the topic of yet another presentation, not this one. What I do want to talk about is the relationship between alcohol and guns, and the relationship between alcohol, guns, and family violence. Guns are kept at home most of the time in states like Rhode Island that we don't have open carry laws for guns. And so if you have a gun in proximity of a violent family situation, it's more likely to be used. If, however, a potential victim can get away, the gun is less likely to be used. So once again, just the proximity of guns being in the household and families being stuck in the households will increase the likelihood of gun use in family violence situations during the COVID-19 stay-at-home rules. The use of alcohol and guns are often they're often correlated, and they often create ill effects, obviously. But the use of alcohol in family violence is incredibly high. Most serious cases of family violence where serious injury is incurred involves the use of alcohol. Illicit drugs, they're also a problem, but to a much lesser extent than the use of alcohol. Alcohol is a depressant. It doesn't actually make people violent. It's physiologically impossible for that drug to make people violent. But what it does is it lowers the inhibitions people have against acting out. So under normal sober circumstances, a person might be reluctant to act out on their violent thoughts. When they're under the influence of alcohol, they're much more likely to act out. And so I find it interesting that during the COVID-19 stay-at-home rules, we still have unlimited access to alcohol, guns, and ammunition, which have to have an impact on the lethality of family violence during this pandemic. There's a very well-known theory by Lenore Walker, who was a clinical psychologist, and it's an interpersonal cycle of violence theory. In the first phase in a relationship that will result in some form of family violence, there's a building of tension across time. And that tension builds up to a point where there is some form of abuse or acute battering stage. So the difference between abuse and an acute battering stage is that an acute battering stage may may span a period of time. It may be an hour of abuse, it may be 4 days of abuse, but it spans a period of time. And then there's usually a tipping effect where some form of injury gets extreme, or the acute battering becomes very extreme, and then it sort of the relationship shifts back into what's referred to as the honeymoon stage, where the offender might say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry this happened. It'll never happen again. It's so unlike me. I was drunk," or whatever the excuse may be. And the victim often really wants it to be an anomaly, really doesn't want to believe that they're in an abusive relationship. And so the couple kind of moves into this honeymoon stage. Now, these three stages are not evenly spaced apart. The tension building stage is typically the longest early in a relationship. But that tension building stage becomes shorter and shorter and shorter over time. Well, this pandemic may exacerbate the cycling that happens between these three stages due to increased exposure to family members and opportunities for violence. From the theory, we know that the more times the cycle is completed, the less time it takes to complete it. And so the couple transitions between these three phases more rapidly the more often they go through these three stages. There's also increased severity in the level of violence that occurs depending on the length of time it takes the cycle to be completed. So when it cycles through rapidly, the battering becomes more and more intense. As time goes on, the explosive event that occurs to create the acute battering stage can become more dangerous, and the honeymoon stage will become shorter and shorter and possibly disappear completely. So what I'm saying here is this is a normal progression for abuse that is identified in interpersonal relationships that are unhealthy. But being exposed to one another all the time and being under this threat and the strain that's involved in being under the threat of the pandemic, could exacerbate this cycling and make it worse more rapidly than without it. The necessary social reactions that are designed to curb the COVID-19 pandemic, staying at home, which is necessary, are creating situations that are conducive to family violence. By isolating family members and families, introducing strain in epidemic proportions in a lot of families, and instilling a new normal for communication within the household, these things are creating problems that we're going to see the ripple effects of for a very, very long time. So we need to start thinking about how to resolve this situation, how to sort of buffer the effects of COVID-19 on families. Will arrests for domestic violence increase during COVID-19? I don't believe that arrest rates will rise during COVID-19 stay at home, even though prevalence will rise. You have to be careful not to confuse arrest rates with prevalence. Even though more violence is likely to occur in all forms, and the violence that pre-existed COVID-19 within families will get more intense and more severe, arrest rates may actually decrease during COVID-19. So some of the reasons are, will police want to interact or remove people from the home? Will police officers be more reluctant to go into homes and arrest people who need to be removed from the situation? Will police develop a threshold of expectations or normalize common couple violence during COVID-19? So will police officers think, well, yeah, everybody's kind of stressed, so of course we're going to see a little more arguing and a little more fights between couples. That's just normal. It's not abuse. That's what's meant by normalizing the behavior. And what do we do with children in households when both partners are arrested for domestic violence, especially under COVID-19, where foster care restrictions are in place? You don't want to be taking children out of one home and putting them into another home where they might be exposed to COVID-19. There's a judicial freeze temporarily. The courts are not in session. How will restraining orders and other things be processed? Well, in the state of Rhode Island, we've been pretty proactive about that, but not all states have. How to identify victims from offenders? There may be a possible increase in bidirectional violence, where without any alternatives, somebody who is typically the victim may turn around and be more forceful in defending themselves because they have fewer resources to get away from the situation. And that may appear as bidirectional violence, especially to responding police officers or social workers. What's happening globally with respect to COVID-19 and family violence? There are cultural differences, and cultural differences produce various responses. Here's a rather negative response. In Malaysia, the government issued a series of posters to discourage family violence. So they had a good idea in mind, or let's say their intent was in the right place, but their approach was fairly backwards. One graphic they produced urged women working from home to dress up and wear makeup. And another poster encourages women to use a silly voice instead of nagging about chores. And another one shows a man sitting on the couch while asking his wife not to be sarcastic about the household chores. These ads, by the way, were only out for a very short period of time, and there was quite an intense global reaction to these really very draconian ideas, and the government revoked these pretty quickly. You can find more detailed information about these. There are various articles that have been published, one by the New York Times about it, another by the BBC. There's some very positive cultural responses across the globe. In Argentina, the government declared pharmacies as safe places for victims during the pandemic. I really like that idea because you can walk into a pharmacy and get the kind of help that you need. You're much less likely to be welcomed into, say, a grocery store or something like that. Pharmacies are set up with medical personnel to some extent, people who are familiar with the effects of COVID-19. So they're being used as safe places in Argentina for victims of domestic violence during the pandemic. In France, free hotel rooms have been arranged for victims of interpersonal violence during the pandemic. In Canada and Australia, they've incorporated funding specifically for domestic violence victims during COVID-19 into their federal economic relief packages. In the United Nations actually posted an official statement about the association between COVID-19 and family violence that encourages nations to address potential increases in family violence during COVID-19. There have also been a whole host of celebrities who have stepped up to help domestic violence during the pandemic. Singer Rihanna donated $4.2 million to Los Angeles victims of domestic violence during the pandemic. There's a famous filmmaker in India, Nadine Labaki, who started the We Stand Together social media campaign to encourage local and national governments to address domestic violence issues during the pandemic. She even organized a series of public service announcements that you can view on the internet that are being aired on public TV in India on a regular nightly basis to help victims of domestic violence. So a lot of people, a lot of different cultures have really reached out to this issue and tried to make some positive changes. So, putting the pieces together here, the pandemic is touching every corner of society, every social institution, and every one of them will be changed by it, not just tomorrow, but probably forever in one way or another. Although there are good reasons for stay at home policies during the pandemic, good things often have dysfunctional latent consequences, like increased family violence. There's already some evidence that family violence is increasing and possibly becoming more lethal during COVID-19. But there will also be ripple effects that are felt long after the pandemic diminishes. We need a call to action. We have to get out in front of the ripple effects and inform first responders like police and rescue workers about what to watch for and how to respond proactively to potential family violence. We have to reach out to neighbors, friends, and other family members, even if it's only remotely, to check on them, especially those ones we may be more concerned about. We have to target pandemic relief funding to aid victims of family violence, but we also need to create programs to treat offenders because treating only the victims will only resolve a portion of the problem. Most help for family violence is aimed to assist victims because their needs are immediate and they're never responsible for the things that they're experiencing. Nonetheless, if we are ever going to really curb family violence, we have to address offending too, and not by punishment, but by re-socializing and rehabilitating offenders, especially young and first-time offenders. Intervention is what's needed. And unfortunately, most offenders don't get the help that they need until there's a situation that is acute enough to cause physical harm to somebody else and result in an arrest. Sometimes courts will require that the offender undergo treatment. Another way that offenders get treatment is to pay for it themselves and go to a clinical setting, which a lot of offenders can't afford. Not everybody can afford that. Not everybody's insurance covers that, and so on. And so what we've done as a society long before COVID-19 is we've decided to focus energies and treatments on victims and services on victims and ignore the offenders until the abuse is severe. I think that's a mistake that needs to be addressed, especially as we transition through this pandemic. You can get local help by the Rhode Island Coalition, if you're in Rhode Island, from the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. The Rhode Island Attorney General's website has a list of help organizations. Crossroads Rhode Island is a great program. Their website is incredibly thorough. You can go on to any of these websites. There's also the National Domestic Violence Hotline. If you are a victim, if you are an offender and you don't want to be, very few offenders are living happy, wonderful lives. They're usually severely depressed by the behavior that they are initiating. They can also be suffering from mental illnesses that are currently being untreated. And so it's really important that no matter what the situation is, no matter which end of this spectrum you're sitting on, that if you need the help, you go and get it. And these are also places you can go to get help for other people who are experiencing these problems. Well, I know it sounds a little bleak, but there is hope on the horizon. I think that some of the things that will come of the increases in family violence during this pandemic is greater attention paid to it. Hopefully that attention isn't just directed at victims, but also at curbing offending. So thanks for listening. Stay healthy. Stay safe.